In wartime, nothing is truly yours. The government doesn't just ask for your sacrifice, it legally engineers it, reaching into your kitchen, your closet, and even your conversations. These weren't random rules. They were the cold, hard calculus of survival, transforming everyday life into a tightly controlled machine. We have found 50 of the most extreme laws that prove when a nation is fighting for its life, the first casualty is always your personal freedom. 1. In World War II, Britain, it was illegal to cause alarm or despondency. This fantastically vague law basically meant that if you were caught being a bit too pessimistic down at the pub about the war effort, you could be fined or even imprisoned. The government's keep calm and carry on wasn't just a catchy poster, it was a legally enforceable mandate. Imagine getting arrested for being a downer. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, bad vibes. 2. During the First World War, flying a kite in the United Kingdom became a serious offense under the Defense of the Realm Act. While it sounds like the government was waging a war on childhood fun, the logic was surprisingly sound. Authorities feared that a simple kite could be used to signal German U-boats offshore or guide Zeppelin airships toward their targets. Suddenly, that innocent diamond in the sky looked a lot like a treacherous beacon for the enemy, turning a windy day at the park into a potential act of treason. 3. For a brief, dark period in American history, sliced bread was outlawed. In 1943, the U.S. government banned the sale of pre-sliced loaves to conserve wax paper and the steel used in slicing machines for the war effort. The public outcry was so immediate and so fierce that the ban was lifted in less than 2 months. It turns out that threatening an American's convenience is a battle you are destined to lose. The greatest thing was temporarily cancelled. 4. Pigeons in London's Trafalgar Square are an iconic sight. But during World War II, feeding them could get you into trouble. With food rationing in full effect, every crumb of bread was precious. Wasting it on what some officials called rats with wings was seen as deeply unpatriotic. The birds were accused of freeloading while the nation tightened its belt. So, if you were caught tossing your crusts to the cooing masses, you could face a stern lecture and a fine from a passing police officer. 5. The British blackout regulations were famously strict. It wasn't just about turning off your lights, it was about ensuring not a single sliver of light escaped your home. A tiny crack in your blackout curtains could earn you a hefty fine from an air raid warden. People painted their windows black and installed complex light traps on their doors. Your home had to become a miniature black hole, because that stray beam from your reading lamp could theoretically guide a Luftwaffe bomber directly to your neighborhood. 6. In the United States, the government enacted a speed limit of 35 miles per hour. This wasn't about safety, it was a desperate measure to conserve rubber and gasoline. The logic was that slower speeds caused less wear and tear on tires, which were nearly impossible to replace as rubber supplies were diverted to military use. Imagine the land of the open road, the nation that practically invented car culture, being forced to crawl along its highways at a speed that would make a modern cyclist impatient. It was a patriotic traffic jam that lasted for years. 7. During World War II, the British government banned all weather forecasts. This wasn't because they were tired of meteorologists getting it wrong. It was to prevent the enemy from gaining crucial intelligence. Knowledge of wind patterns, cloud cover, and fog could give German bombers a massive advantage for planning air raids. For years, the British public had no idea if they should carry an umbrella or not, a state of uncertainty that, for them, must have been a unique form of psychological torture. 8. From 1942 to 1945, it was illegal for any American company to manufacture and sell a new car for civilian use. The entire automotive industry, the titan of the American economy, was ordered to stop everything and start building tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines instead. If your car broke down, you had to fix it, because buying a new one was literally not an option. Dealerships that once gleamed with new models became glorified repair shops overnight, waiting for the day they could sell a car that wasn't painted olive drab. 9. Think twice before offering to buy the next round in wartime Britain. A bizarre law was introduced that made it illegal to treat someone to an alcoholic drink. The government, in its infinite wisdom, believed that buying rounds encouraged excessive drinking, which in turn led to workers showing up late or hungover to the munitions factories. The deeply ingrained cultural tradition of pub generosity was suddenly outlawed in the name of industrial efficiency. You had to go Dutch or go home. 10. American men's fashion became a matter of federal regulation. To conserve wool, the War Production Board issued Order L85, which dictated exactly how suits could be made. It banned pant cuffs, vests for double-breasted suits, and even extra pockets. The order specified the maximum length of a suit jacket and the maximum width of the trousers' bottoms. Suddenly, your tailor wasn't just a craftsman. He was an agent of the federal government, forced to make you look stylishly minimalist for Uncle Sam. 11. For centuries, the sound of church bells was the heartbeat of every British village and city. But in 1940, that heartbeat stopped. The government ordered a complete ban on the ringing of all church bells across the country. This profound, eerie silence was to be broken for one reason, and one reason only: to signal an invasion by German paratroopers. The sound that once called people to prayer or celebration was deliberately transformed into the nation's official alarm bell, a harbinger of doom. Imagine hearing that sound after months of silence, knowing it meant the final battle for your home had just begun. 12. The pen may be mightier than the sword, but during World War II, the typewriter was deemed a strategic weapon. In 1942, the US government completely halted the production of new typewriters for the general public. Why? Because the factories and the metal were needed for guns and ammunition. If you were a writer, a student, or ran a small business, you had to make do with what you had. Suddenly, a sticky E key wasn't just an annoyance. It was a crisis with no solution. 13. For a few years, "Will you marry me?" was a question that came with a government-approved answer. In Britain, the production of traditional gold wedding rings was banned to conserve the precious metal. Couples had to exchange utility rings, which were made of cheaper metals and legally could not weigh more than 2 pennyweights, about an eighth of an ounce. Your lifelong commitment had to be symbolized by a ring that was as austere and regulated as everything else in your life. 14. In Britain, the famous Dig for Victory campaign wasn't just a friendly suggestion, it had the force of law behind it. The government could compel citizens and local councils to convert any open land into vegetable gardens. This meant immaculate private lawns, public parks, and even the manicured flower beds of stately homes were dug up to plant potatoes and onions. The moat of the Tower of London was drained and used to grow cabbages. It was the ultimate war on ornamental gardening. 15. If you looked at the New York City skyline in 1942, you'd see a dark, ghostly version of the city we know today. Under strict dim-out regulations, all coastal cities had to extinguish or shield any light that could be seen from the sea. This was because German U-boats were lurking just offshore, using the bright lights of cities like Miami and New York to perfectly silhouette cargo ships, making them easy targets. The bright lights of Broadway didn't just go dim, they became a potential accomplice to enemy submarines. 16. Getting married during the war in Britain came with some very specific and very bland regulations. A government order banned any kind of elaborate cake decoration. Specifically, there was to be no white icing, as both sugar and eggs were severely rationed. Couples celebrating the most important day of their lives had to do so with what was essentially a plain, undecorated fruitcake. The government was so serious about austerity, it even crashed your wedding reception. 17. During World War II, simply carrying a camera in certain parts of the United States could get you arrested. Large swaths of the country, particularly around military bases, ports, and industrial centers, were designated as restricted zones. Being caught with a camera in these areas, even if you were just an innocent tourist, was enough to be detained on suspicion of espionage. Can you even imagine trying to enforce a rule like that today? In a world where every single person is carrying a high-definition camera in their pocket? 18. The British government literally regulated the depth of your bathwater. To conserve fuel needed to heat water, a law was passed decreeing that no citizen could have more than 5 inches of water in their tub. To ensure compliance, a bold red line was painted on the inside of many bathtubs across the nation, acting as a domestic plimsoll line for personal hygiene. It's one thing for the government to be in your business, but it's another for it to be in your bathtub with a ruler. 19. In Britain, the phrase "woman's work" was redefined by law. The government issued orders that could compel any unmarried woman between the ages of 20 and 30 to leave her current job and take up essential war work in a factory, on a farm, or in the armed forces. There were very few exceptions. It was a national draft, but for labor, not combat. Your career path was no longer your choice. It was determined by the Ministry of Labor and the needs of the war machine. 20. For a few terrifying weeks in 1944, British intelligence was convinced that the nation's crossword puzzles were being used to leak top-secret D-Day invasion plans. A series of key code words, including Utah, Omaha, Overlord, and Neptune, appeared as answers in the Daily Telegraph crossword just before the landings. MI5 agents stormed the home of the puzzle's creator, a quiet schoolmaster named Leonard Daw, and subjected him to a grueling interrogation. It turned out to be a mind-boggling coincidence. Daw had simply asked his students for interesting words, and they had picked them up from the loose talk of soldiers billeted nearby. 21. Dreaming of a white Christmas? Well, during World War II, you'd better have been dreaming of a dark one. The US government instituted a nationwide ban on all outdoor Christmas light displays. This draconian holiday killjoy wasn't about suppressing cheer, but about conserving electricity for war factories and maintaining strict blackout conditions on the coasts. Any festive homeowner who dared to plug in their lights could expect a visit not from Santa Claus, but from a stern air raid warden with a hefty fine. 22. Got some juicy gossip for your cousin in another city? During the war in Britain, you had to keep it to yourself. The government heavily restricted long-distance telephone calls, urging the public to avoid any frivolous conversations. The lines were needed for urgent military and civil defense communications. Operators could and would interrupt your call if they deemed it unimportant. It was the analog version of a nationwide "do not disturb" mode, enforced by law. 23. Your friendly neighborhood pigeon fancier was considered a potential national security threat in wartime Britain. Under the Defense of the Realm Act, it became a serious crime to own any unregistered racing or carrier pigeons. The government wasn't worried about the birds making a mess. They were terrified that a German spy could attach a tiny canister of vital intelligence to a pigeon's leg and send it flying back to the continent. This turned the entire pigeon-keeping community into a network that was either working for the crown or under deep suspicion. Any unidentified pigeon was to be caught and reported, turning a quaint hobby into a high-stakes game of counter-espionage. 24. Even man's best friend was expected to do his patriotic duty. In both Britain and the US, governments conducted a dog census and encouraged citizens to loan their pets to the military for service as sentries, messengers, or mine detectors. While not a strict law forcing you to give up your dog, the social pressure was immense. If your dog wasn't serving, it was seen as a slacker. 25. With nylon and silk being requisitioned for parachutes and military supplies, women's stockings vanished from stores almost overnight. This created a national crisis for fashion-conscious women. But ingenuity, not law, found a solution. The era of the painted-on stocking was born. Women would use leg makeup to create the illusion of stockings, and then, with a steady hand, draw a perfect seam down the back of their legs using an eyebrow pencil. In a world of rationing and sacrifice, a wobbly seam was a minor social catastrophe. 26. The age of civilian air travel in the United States was put on indefinite hold. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government effectively nationalized the entire domestic airline industry. Almost half of all commercial aircraft were immediately requisitioned for military use, and all remaining civilian flights were placed under the control of the Air Transport Command. Getting a seat on a plane became nearly impossible unless you had official military orders or government business of the highest priority. The jet-set age was grounded before it even began. 27. Writing a letter to a loved one serving overseas was a sacred act, but you were never just writing to them. You were also writing to a government censor with a very sharp pair of scissors. Under sweeping censorship laws in both the US and Britain, every single piece of personal mail was opened and read. Officials weren't just hunting for military secrets. They were on a mission to stamp out bad vibes. A soldier's complaint about the awful food, or a wife's passing mention of a leaky roof, could be physically cut out of the letter, leaving a literal hole in the page. The government essentially became your relationship's overprotective parent, deciding what news you were emotionally stable enough to handle. 28. Your country didn't just want your scrap metal, it wanted your hair. In one of the war's strangest campaigns, the US government asked women to donate their long hair to the war effort. This wasn't for wigs. Human hair was the perfect material for the crosshairs in high-precision bomb sights, as it's incredibly fine and doesn't expand or contract with temperature changes. Patriotic women made a very personal sacrifice at the salon, their clippings sent off to become a vital part of military targeting technology. 29. The government didn't just want you to work hard, it wanted you to be miserable while doing it. In many towns and cities across America, with federal encouragement, officials enacted strict bans on public dances. Dance halls were condemned as dens of frivolity that wasted precious electricity, encouraged absenteeism from vital factory jobs, and were simply bad for public morale. It was the ultimate fun police action on a national scale, as if officials believed a well-executed jitterbug could somehow give aid and comfort to the enemy. Your patriotic duty wasn't just to build tanks, it was to do so without tapping your feet. 30. In the land of the automobile and the open road, the government made it illegal to go for a drive just for fun. The Office of Price Administration banned all pleasure driving to conserve gasoline and rubber. To enforce this, they issued gas ration stickers for windshields. An A sticker for non-essential driving got you a measly few gallons a week, while a C sticker for essential workers like doctors got you more. The FBI was even tasked with investigating reports of people violating the pleasure driving ban, turning a Sunday drive into a federal offense. 31. In a land that worships the automobile, the US government suddenly saw the humble bicycle as a vital transportation alternative. And then, in a stunning display of bureaucratic logic, they immediately banned the production of all new bicycles in 1942. The steel, rubber, and manpower were needed for the war effort. This created a frantic, nationwide market for used bikes as people scrambled to find a way to get to work without using precious gasoline. Your 10-speed wasn't just a toy, it was a strategic asset you couldn't replace. 32. In one of the most ruthless efficiency drives imaginable, it became illegal in wartime Britain to use any metal for making a mousetrap. The steel used for the spring mechanism was deemed essential for building weapons. For the duration of the war, the nation's mouse-catching duties fell to cats and old-fashioned wooden traps. Britain was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Axis powers, and a slightly less dignified, lower-stakes war against its own rodent population, armed with inferior technology. 33. During the First World War, anti-German hysteria in the United States led to laws in over a dozen states banning the teaching of the German language in any school. In some places, it was illegal to even speak German in public. Libraries purged German books from their shelves, and orchestras refused to play the music of Bach and Beethoven. It was a cultural witch hunt that branded an entire language as inherently treasonous. 34. Got a sweet tooth? Too bad. In 1943, the US government completely outlawed the sale of whipped cream. This wasn't because it was considered frivolous, but because the butterfat used to make it was desperately needed for the war effort. The ban was so absolute that even possessing a can of it was technically illegal. For the duration of the war, American desserts became significantly flatter and a little more depressing. 35. The phrase "cradle to grave" took on a new meaning in the United States when the War Production Board outlawed the manufacturing of metal caskets. Steel and copper were far too valuable for the war effort to be buried in the ground. For several years, Americans were laid to rest in simpler, wooden coffins. It was a stark reminder that even in death, your final contribution to the war effort was to be less resource-intensive. Your patriotism followed you right to the cemetery. 36. Fashion became a matter of national security when the U.S. War Production Board put a legal limit on the height of women's shoe heels, capping them at 1 inch. The goal was to conserve the leather used in the uppers and the steel used for structural support. High heels were officially declared non-essential, forcing a generation of women into more practical and significantly shorter footwear for the sake of the war effort. 37. Fancy a holiday? In wartime Britain, you first needed the government's permission. The railway network was under immense strain from moving troops and supplies, so authorities instituted a ban on all non-essential long-distance travel. To take a train beyond a certain radius from your home, you had to prove your journey was absolutely necessary. A seaside vacation was not considered necessary. The entire concept of a spontaneous getaway simply ceased to exist. 38. The famous slogan, "Careless talk costs lives," wasn't just a friendly reminder on a poster. It was backed by the full force of the law. In Britain, it became a criminal offense to spread any information, however trivial it seemed, that could be useful to the enemy. This included gossiping in a pub about a local factory's production schedule or mentioning a relative's troop movements in a letter. People were actively encouraged to report their neighbors for loose lips, turning every public space into a potential listening post for the authorities. 39. If you were a British homeowner during the Blitz, the government legally required you to own a very specific piece of equipment, a stirrup pump. This was a simple, hand-operated water pump designed to extinguish small fires started by incendiary bombs. Not only did you have to own one, but you were also expected to be fully trained in its use. It was a stark acknowledgement that in this new kind of war, your living room was now part of the front line, and you were the designated firefighter. 40. To conserve clay, fuel, and factory space, the British government passed the Utility Scheme, which included a ban on the production of non-essential pottery. This meant no more decorative vases, no more intricate china sets, and, most tragically for some, no more new garden gnomes. For several years, the nation's gnome population was frozen in time. If your gnome was smashed in an air raid, it was a loss you simply had to endure until victory was declared. 41. In one of the most drastic and disorienting measures of the war, the British government made it illegal to have any signposts on the roads. Every single sign indicating a town name, a street, or a distance was systematically removed and hidden. The logic was that if German paratroopers invaded, they would be completely lost, wandering aimlessly through the British countryside, unable to find their targets. It was a brilliant, low-tech form of geographical warfare that turned the entire country into an unnavigable maze for friend and foe alike. 42. Setting up a new home in wartime. Britain was a Spartan affair. The government introduced the Utility Scheme, which banned the manufacture and sale of all new non-essential furniture. If you wanted a new wardrobe or a table, you had to buy a government-approved utility model, a brutally simple, undecorated piece built for function over form. All ornamentation, carving, or even a hint of style was forbidden to conserve wood and labor. Your home decor was now subject to the same aesthetic principles as a military barracks. 43. If you had a penny in your pocket in the US in 1943, it would have looked strangely silvery. That's because the government legally mandated that all new pennies be struck from steel instead of copper. Copper was a critical component for ammunition casings and wiring, far too valuable to be jangling around in people's pockets. The public generally hated the new steel cents. They rusted, were magnetic, and were easily confused with dimes. Do you happen to have one of these strange historical artifacts in an old coin jar somewhere? 44. That extra bag of sugar in your pantry could have landed you in serious legal trouble. In both the US and Britain, anti-hoarding laws were passed that made it a crime to stockpile any rationed goods beyond a small, specified amount. These laws were enforced by local wardens who were encouraged to keep an eye on their neighbors' shopping habits. It turned your kitchen cupboards into a potential crime scene and made a simple trip to the grocery store an act fraught with legal peril. 45. Going out to eat in wartime Britain meant less choice, by law. To conserve food and labor, the Ministry of Food passed an order restricting restaurant menus. A meal could have no more than 3 courses, and the number of main dishes offered had to be severely limited. Even the price was capped. The era of the lavish, multi-page menu was over, replaced by a simple card that basically asked, "What version of potatoes would you like with your other rationed item?" 46. In America during the First World War, anti-German sentiment was so high that anything with a German name was considered suspect, including your food. Sauerkraut, by popular demand and official encouragement, was patriotically renamed Liberty Cabbage. Hamburgers became Liberty Steaks. It was a bizarre, nationwide rebranding campaign fueled by paranoia. What do you think? What modern food item would you rename for patriotic reasons today? Let us know your best suggestions in the comments. 47. Want a new phone line for your home in 1940s America? Get in line. The War Production Board severely restricted the installation of new private telephone lines, preserving the copper wire and the technician's time for military and essential business use. Unless you were a doctor or directly involved in the war effort, your chances of getting a new phone were practically zero. How long do you think modern society would last if new internet and phone connections were suddenly banned tomorrow? A week? A day? 48. In coastal areas of Britain, even the direction of the wind became a state secret. The government ordered the removal of all weather vanes from public buildings and churches. The fear was that a German spy on the ground could use the vane to relay information about wind conditions to incoming bombers or U-boats offshore. The simple, centuries-old tool for predicting the next rain shower was suddenly seen as a potential instrument of espionage, a silent traitor turning in the breeze. 49. The war temporarily silenced more than just the weather forecasts. It silenced the creation of new music, in a way. The U.S. War Production Board ordered a complete halt to the manufacturing of all new musical instruments. The brass was needed for shell casings, and the wood was needed for rifle stocks. This meant that for several years, American musicians had to fight the war with the trombone they had, not the trombone they wanted. All right, we've covered 49 points, and only one final bizarre rule remains. But before we get to number 50, it's time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the single most unbelievably intrusive law from today's list goes to the British 5-inch bathwater limit. Simply because the image of the government physically painting a "fill-to-here" line inside your private bathtub represents the absolute pinnacle of wartime bureaucracy invading the most personal space imaginable. Do you agree with our verdict? Or did another law deserve this dubious honor? Let us know what you think in the comments. And now, for our final number. 50. In Britain, you could be legally compelled to sit on your own roof all night and wait for it to be set on fire. Under the Fire Watch orders, all factories, businesses, and residential blocks were required to create a rota of occupants to stand guard on the roof during air raids. Their job was to spot and extinguish small incendiary bombs before they could burn the building down, armed with nothing more than a bucket of sand and that government-mandated stirrup pump. This wasn't a volunteer position. If it was your turn on the rota, you went. It was a terrifying mandatory duty that turned ordinary accountants, shopkeepers, and secretaries into frontline firefighters on the most dangerous battlefield of all, their own homes. So it's clear. Winning a war demanded the total surrender of personal choice. From the depth of your bathwater to to the food on your plate. It makes you look at your own daily life in a different light. So, a simple question for you. Which one of these laws would you have the hardest time following? Drop your answer in the comments below. We're genuinely curious to see what you choose. If you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be told, liking this video and subscribing is the best way to help us uncover more.